Our next speaker is our guest of honor. He's known as the father of impact investing. Sir Ronald Cohen is here with us today. May I please maybe put your hands together? Do you want to sit here? So welcome.
Thank you.
Ronnie.
Wonderful to be.
It's such a privilege to have you here today with us. I remember myself reading your book in 2020, and I was amazed with it. I was inspired, and that's how we came up until now. I'm still pinching myself. Can't believe that you're here today with us. And we have a beautiful crowd here today to listen to you. And we are going to talk about impact leadership, and you're an impact leader. So in your book, you have reminding us about the current status of the world. And you are coming with a suggestion to change the world. And it reads as, throughout the world, capitalism and democracy are being challenged with great force. The world must change, but we cannot change it by throwing money to at old ideas that no longer work. We need a new path to a new world where inequality is shrinking, where natural resources are regenerated, and people can benefit from a shared prosperity. There is a will, there is a way, and now it's the time you act. You put it in your book. But how are we going to change the world? And what is the perception of doing business? Can changing the world and making profit go hand in hand?
Wonderful, Şafak. And let me start by thanking you and our hosts from Türkiye for this very warm welcome to the world's impact movement. You have here the leadership of the global movement, and we are delighted that your efforts over many years have led to our meeting today. I too pinch myself when I think of our first conversation and how quickly you have got this going. Now, many people think that changing the world is an impossible thing, but I have a different view. Because, Şafak, as you know, I started life my career as a venture capitalist at the age of 26 in 1972, when there was no venture capital industry, no tech world, and people thought entrepreneurship, why, that's an American phenomenon. It'll never catch on anywhere. And most people then thought, how can you expect to make money out of backing young entrepreneurs with no business experience who want to overtake the biggest companies in the world? Crazy. And from an investment point of view, and when we talk about Islamic finance today, it's a lesser problem than it was for venture capital to adapt finance to conform. How can you expect an investor to invest in a venture capital fund backing these crazy people, not get a return for up to 10 years, and have the possibility of losing all their money? It's not going to work, right? And of course, today, 40 years later, we're sitting, 50 years later, we're sitting here and we've seen the world change completely because of technology. What led me to believe that the world would change was that I was in the US when venture capital was just beginning to emerge. I was at Harvard Business School, and I could see that the new technologies required this different approach to investing. You couldn't expect to build a company with a revolutionary technology by funding it with bank finance, or through investment in equity like a public company. You needed a new form of finance. And this is where I say that I have the same feeling about impact changing the world as I did about technology, entrepreneurship, and venture capital changing the world. And of course, there's a big similarity between the two, because impact is being driven today by young entrepreneurs who are investing in new business models that achieve risk, return, and impact. And some less young entrepreneurs who have proved that this works. So if you look at Tesla today, sure, Elon Musk is crazy in many ways. However, Tesla was the first company that optimized risk, return, and impact to create a company worth $1 trillion at the time. It's come down, but nevertheless, very valuable company. It would not have got its first customers if it hadn't been for the environmental goal that it had. It wouldn't have attracted its first talent or its first investors. If you had gone to investors and said, will you invest in a new automobile company? Are we going to be better designed than the others, but it's the same engine? You would have raised nothing, okay? And what we can see happening before our eyes today, I mentioned it at our own meeting of the leadership today, is there are three forces changing the world. We are not changing the world against the trends. We are changing the world by supporting three major trends. The first, it was referred to many times in this morning's meeting, is a change of values. Values don't change completely, often, as much as they are doing today. 15 years ago, we started to see young people refusing to buy the products of certain companies because of the harm they create, or to work for them. Investors began to be aware that this had implications for the profitability of their investments. When I led the G8 task force with many people in the room who are part of the GLG leadership today and who were part of the G8 task force then, ESG was $13 trillion. Today, it's over $40 trillion. Impact investment, zero. Nobody believed in measuring impact in those days. Today, $2.5 trillion, not billion, trillion dollars. In the last 3-4 years alone, we've seen a new financial security come along, a sustainability-linked bond or loan, where the rate of interest that the borrower pays, so a company borrows money on the bond market, Novartis, pharmaceutical company, Swiss pharmaceutical company, as you know, raises $1.8 billion in a sustainability-linked bond, where if its drugs achieve penetration of vulnerable communities beyond a certain percentage of its sales, its rate of interest falls. That market has gone from zero to over $1.5 trillion in 3 or 4 years. And then the second force is the force of technology. Just as Tesla has brought new technology, we're seeing entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurship is a global phenomenon. It's thriving here in Türkiye, in every one of the 36 countries, and soon the 45 or 50 countries of the GSG. We're seeing entrepreneurs create business models that have purpose as well as profit in mind, where they are creating a way of delivering impact and making money at the same time. It's happening in education, in health, in fintech, in every area, in transport, in clean energy, everywhere. You are seeing entrepreneurs driving technology to achieve impact. And of course, the scope of artificial intelligence, machine learning, augmented reality to deliver impact globally is greater than humanity has ever had before. And so entrepreneurs understand this. And that's why in the book I refer to the fact that an impact unicorn now isn't just a venture that becomes worth $1 billion. It's a venture that does that and also improves the lives of 1 billion people. And that, in my experience, is the ambition of the young generation today, to do good and to do well. The third force is the one people outside of this hall are completely unaware of for the most part. And it's the force of impact transparency, which the GSG, in all modesty, can claim to have put on the map. We see today the SEC imposing mandatory, it hasn't made it through the American political system, but the proposal is there and something will emerge in the next few months. Mandatory disclosure by companies, big and small, of all the environmental impacts they create. That's major. That means every company will be reporting not just on profit, but on environmental impact. Across the Atlantic, you have the EU, which started a few years ago to impose transparency on investment vehicles. You can't put transparency on an investment fund if you don't have transparency on the companies in the fund's portfolio. And then you have the creation of the ISSB, which is part of, excuse all these initials, the organization which is responsible for financial accounting across the whole world, IFRS, standardizing the metrics for both environmental and social impacts. And the GSG took the opportunity 4 years ago to create, with Harvard Business School and the Impact Management Project, a huge initiative called the IWAI, the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative. And if you want a revolutionary idea which is coming into being, how about saying, why don't we translate impact into money so that we can compare impacts with one another and with profit, bring them into financial analysis and therefore into the valuation of companies. After 3 years of analyzing thousands of companies and publishing their impacts, we got insights we had never had before, Şafak. We found that if you looked at the 3,000 companies whose environmental impacts we had measured in monetary terms, 450 created more damage than profit in a year. We've never had insights like this before. And I can go on about diversity. The diversity deficit of Amazon today is $6.5 billion a year, taking the lost remuneration of ethnic and gender groups who are missing if you compare the demographics inside and outside Amazon facilities. Apple, $2.4 billion. Does that mean Apple's a better performer? Not if you compare it to wage bill. Amazon 16%, Apple 24%. And so you can see, Şafak, that the world is changing. If you take these three forces together, the force of values, of technology, and transparency on impacts, the world is changing in the direction of the title of impact economies, which deliver the optimization of risk, return, and impact. Not making money without worrying about consequences, but making money and bringing solutions to the big social and environmental challenges we face.
I think you have pretty much covered the aspects of the impact revolution you have suggested in your book. You have mentioned it in your book. How do you think it's evolving, and what does it mean today for us, impact revolution? What will it mean for tomorrow?
So this is why I'm so impressed that the government has been involved in the creation of this NAB and that we have representatives of government here today. My surprise, relative to my expectations at the time of the G8 task force in 2013-14, or the time when we invented the social impact bond in 2010, and congratulations on launching the first Turkish impact bond, was that government and philanthropists would be the first to adopt this. And what you hear from my comments is that really they haven't. It's the public markets, it's the financial markets that have gone to the trillions. And governments, whether it's the Obama administration with its $500 million in its budget, or the UK administration with a few $100 million in its budget, or the French administration with a similar amount, are still experimenting with this idea of impact investment. If you're interested, I can go into the reasons why it takes time to change the mindset of government on this issue. And so we find ourselves in a revolution today which is being driven by investors. Why is it being driven by investors? Because investors understand that the best way of doing business and investing today is to optimize risk, return, and impact. And so they are pushing the regulators to make sure they have the information they need. So the efforts that you're seeing today at the SEC and the ISSB and so on are the result of investor pressure. Because if the regulator wants to make sure that all stock price sensitive information is available for every investor at the same time, then they have to have standardization of measurement, and they have to have mandatory publication on a comparable basis. And so the investors are driving this revolution today. And governments are coming in, not at a policy level, although the Biden administration ran on environmental, but also at a regulatory level because of the pressure on regulators. For me, this is inevitable, just like the tech revolution was inevitable. This is happening now before our eyes. It's gone past the point of no return. The train has left the station. And the question now is, are you going to get ahead of, not of the train, but ahead of the curve? Are you going to be ahead of the game? Are you, as a company, going to take advantage of the opportunity this creates, or as an entrepreneur, or as an investor? Or like those who thought the tech revolution would only affect the computer industry, are you going to stand by while other people eat your lunch?
Thank you for reflecting the zeitgeist of impact investing. That was my next question, but you have already covered it very beautifully. And when we talk about impact, it's also related to values, as you mentioned. And how do you think the values are changing?
So what has perhaps been striking is that while my generation and the generation after connected with the environmental issue in a very distant way, this is a far-off thing, we don't need to worry about it. The young generation, which by its nature is more idealistic, more rebellious, and more concerned about the state of the planet it's going to inherit, the young generation led the way in the change, and they influenced their parents. All of you who have children today will be aware that their values are different from the values of my generation, you know? And it's happening because of the enormity of the challenges. And when you see 16-year-olds protest, like Greta, protesting against the inactivity of governments relative to the challenge, you understand that the fear of planet destruction And for many, the realization that the social inequalities that are shaking the stability of governments across the world come from the way we do business and the way we invest. And so the values are changing because of necessity, Şafak.
Yeah, true. Yes, and it takes visionary leadership to change the world, and you're an impact leader. It's transformational. And how would you define impact leadership? Can any of us become impact leaders, and how?
So the first thing is not every one of us feels, they may say they want to be impact leaders, but feel they want to be impact leaders. And impact leadership involves having a deep understanding of what we've been talking about today. That you have to invest with values in mind. It has to be profit with purpose. Legislation is going to ensure that it happens. We will get incentives for companies that are delivering positive impacts, tax credits. Maybe somebody in New Zealand got a prize for suggesting, and we have a representative of the New Zealand NAB here, that you should use tax credits to reward companies that deliver positive impact. But we will also see taxation of harmful effects, carbon tax, sugar tax, already being talked about. So the arrival of impact transparency is going to change the way in which government operates. And for government, this is a way of attracting private sector capital at a time when government budgets are hugely constrained, when social issues after COVID and with the decline in the economy because of the Ukraine war, the global economy because of the Ukraine war and so on, governments have here the opportunity to implement their policy objectives in the social and environmental area with other people's money, paying only when the outcomes have been achieved and in a way that is Sharia law compliant. A social impact bond does not receive interest. It receives a gain, a capital gain, at the end of, when the outcomes have been achieved. So you're doing good and doing well, and you don't get interest. And your ambitions of creating a financial center in Turkey, which has its own unique identity, could well revolve around this opportunity to bring modern finance within the ambit of Sharia law, for example. And so when you begin to think about the challenge we as the GSG face, if I may put you in our shoes for a moment, we can see these issues in 50 countries which are represented here today. And we talk to government about them, and government doesn't really do more than listen. And yet, the evidence exists. A social impact bond, you can read the Big Society Capital report in the UK, looking at 90, I think, social impact bonds, delivers in its life, if it's a 5-year bond or 10-year bond, 10 times the investment in socio-economic value. 10 times the investment. If you compare funding inputs, as governments do today, we are going to invest so much in education, versus funding outcomes, we are going to pay so much for every outcomes achieved. Funding outcomes costs less per outcome, per successful outcome. 57% of the cost of paying for inputs is again a Big Society Capital figure based on an example in the mental health area, where government services were compared with and without. So it's an obvious thing for government to do it. Again, that's why I'm impressed that the Turkish government and President Erdogan himself were attracted to the idea of impact investment and felt that, look, this is really relevant to what we're trying to do today. For those who are drawn by the social purpose, it's completely obvious why you should do it. For those, you were talking of values, who haven't changed their values so much and say the market takes care of everything, they say this is a more effective way of spending government money. And so this is really, across all our countries today, a bipartisan issue. And the issue we face country by country is the issue that you face, Şafak, in Turkey. What is going to get us to an economy where you make money and you bring solutions to the social issues of the country and to the environmental issues of the country and of the globe? What are going to be the steps to get us there? And we at the GSG, and you are very well aware of it, have defined these steps. And the purpose of our meeting here is to define country by country the specific steps, because they change according to the countries. They're the same steps, but in different order, different priorities, and so on and so forth, to get us to impact economies. I will just say, Şafak, that when we think in terms of time frames, if you look at the historical parallel, the time frame is very short. The historic parallel is after the crash, the Wall Street crash of 1929, investors realized they had been investing in companies without understanding what profits they really made, because every company picked its own accounting principles and there were no auditors to check the numbers. After the crash, the investors lost fortunes, people were made destitute, the government stepped in, and within 4 years of the crash, in 1933, we introduced, the US famously introduced, generally accepted accounting principles and the use of auditors. Now you could say the crash of COVID-19 was the defining moment for transparency on impacts, for impact accounting, if you like. 2 years after the crash, you had the SEC effort going and the ISSB effort going. Political considerations in the US apart, the EU will move forward with this agenda. In my view, by 2025, that's nearly 3 years from now, we will see many countries introducing the publication of impact statements that show your revenues, your costs, and the 4 categories of impact that companies create. The impact from their operations on the environment, from their employment on people, and from their products and their supply chain on people and the environment. 3 years from now, in my view. In some countries, this will become mandatory, and it'll be the future. And the companies that haven't taken it on board and started to work on reducing their carbon emissions, improving their diversity, reducing the sugar content of their product, are going to be worse off. There'll be innovation that will surpass them, taxation and incentives that will make their lives more difficult.
Yeah, you have set the vision very well, and we have been discussing the Turkish case since yesterday. And I wonder what your take is on Turkey's position being bridging the global north and global south. How do you position Turkey in your mind? And maybe it's worthwhile to talk about impact diplomacy as well, as we are talking about a country bridging different regions and positioned in the heart of the world.
So you could say that the impact movement started in Europe and the US, shifted to Africa and to Asia now. We have many African and Asian representatives at our meeting. And it's now a global phenomenon. and every country has to find its own niche in that. I happen to believe that Islamic finance is a massive opportunity, and that the impact approaches we've been talking about need to be adapted for it and implemented at scale. And so if you begin to define social impact bonds as shuruk, for example, Turkey may have the opportunity to become the leader in the impact bond space. Why? Because as Burak and I were chatting before, people don't understand how important religion is to the financial market in Turkey. If it's not Sharia law compliant, there are many people who won't participate in the market. So if you have latent demand for shuruk investments, which at the same time achieve a social good, then it's an ambition that Turkey, that Turkey could well have to become the leader of the Islamic world in this. It'll have competition from Indonesia, which is also present in the room, and from other Muslim countries, but Malaysia also in the room, and even in the Gulf and perhaps in other areas of the Middle East. But Turkey needs to identify its own objectives, but there's no doubt that there's a big potential in this area.
Thank you so much for your insights. This was wonderful. We thank you for being with us here today and for sharing your thoughts and insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Onward and upward.